Well, today we'll be looking at the effects of corn particle size, complete diet grinding, and diet form on 11 to 20 kilogram nursery pig growth performance, as well as caloric efficiency. My name is John DeYoung. I was the lead author on this trial. I'd like to give a special thanks to New Fashion Pork in Jackson, Minnesota for use of their facilities, as well as a special thanks to the USDA for funding of this project. So just a brief background today before we get started. I think we all know that feed processing technologies are important tools to improve feed efficiency and performance in nursery pigs. And this was shown by Healy and others, as well as Stark and others, both in 1994, who both showed that reducing corn particle size and pelleting diets resulted in improved growth performance, as well as some other improved characteristics. However, little information is available on post-mix grinding and the effects of particle size reduction and pelleting of high byproduct diets, which we sometimes feed to nursery pigs. And thus the objective of our study was to determine the effects of fine grinding corn and diet form, whether that was pellet versus a meal form, on nursery pig growth performance. Now, in order to accomplish this objective, a total of 996 pigs, initially weighing 11.1 kilograms of body weight, were used in the 21-day Phase 3 study. Pigs were randomly allotted to pens upon entry into the nursery, and then were allotted randomly to one of 6 dietary treatments based on average pen weight. This allowed us to have 28 pigs per pen, as well as 6 pens per treatment. The same corn-soybean meal-based diet containing both 30% dry distillers grains with solubles as well as 10% wheat middlings was used for all dietary treatments. Now, in order to get our differences between treatments, varying processing techniques were utilized to create the 6 dietary experimental diets. The first diet we utilized roller mill ground corn. The corn was ground to approximately 737 microns, and that diet was either fed in meal form or pellet form there in diet 2. Now, the next set of diets, instead of roller mill grinding that corn, we chose to hammer mill grind that corn and got that corn to an average particle size of 324 microns, and then again fed that in either meal form or pellet form here in diet 4. And lastly, our last 2 diets, we have a complete mixed diet, which contained roller mill ground corn. We then mixed that diet and rerouted the complete mixed diet back to a hammer mill and ground that complete diet to an average diet particle size of 541 microns, and then fed that in either meal or pelleted form. The roller mill that was used utilized 2 rolls. It was a 2-high roller mill from RMS. The hammer mill utilized a 1.6 millimeter screen and was a Jacobson Machine Works hammer mill. As I mentioned before, that diet that was mixed and then completely ground through a hammer mill was actually rerouted to a second hammer mill. We weren't able to get it back to the first hammer mill due to some logistics within the mill, and thus a second hammer mill needed to be used for those last 2 diets. So that complete feed was ground, again using a second hammer mill, but it did have the same size screen at 1.6 millimeters. And lastly, the pellet mill used utilized a 4.2 millimeter die opening, and it was a CPM pellet mill. So pig weight and feed measurement were measured on day 0, 7, 14, and 21 to determine average daily gain, average daily feed intake, and feed efficiency. We also calculated caloric efficiencies, which were determined using calculated metabolizable energy values taken from the NRC and net energy values taken from NRA. Now, just as a brief refresher for some of us who don't know how we calculate caloric efficiency. In order to get caloric efficiency, we take pen feed intake times the dietary energy level in the diet, whether that's ME or net energy level. We can do it on both bases, and then we divide by the total pen gain. And so when we think about caloric efficiency, this is more of a feed to gain number, so a smaller number is going to be better. Feed samples during the trial were taken from each feeder throughout the trial and then combined within treatment for analysis. Bulk density of all ingredients and diets were measured, as well as the particle size and angle of repose, which was determined for all ingredients, both pre and post-grind, and for the diets that were fed in meal form. Now we start talking about those diets that were fed in pelleted form. We measured PDI, a modified PDI, as well as a percent fine for all of those pelleted diets. And lastly, data were analyzed as a completely randomized design using the proc mix procedure in SAS. So here we have the formulation for the dietary treatment that was used throughout the trial. Again, only one formulation was used. I'd like to point out that there were 10% wheat middlings and 30% DDGS. And it's also important to note that corn only represented 33% of the diet, so a fairly small fraction of the diet came from corn. So when we think about grinding only that corn fraction of the diet, we need to remember that it only represented 33% of that total diet. Here we have the proximate analysis of the ingredients used in the trial. I would like to point out that our two high fiber ingredients, both DDGS and MIDS, had ADF and NDF values over 10% for ADF and over 25% for NDF. So they were just showing that they are very high fiber ingredients. And lastly, and probably more importantly for us today, we want to look at the particle size of those four ingredients. We see that the DDGS, the soybean meal, and the MIDS, these are particle size as received at the mill. So DDGS at a particle size just under or just south of 500 microns. Soybean meal is just over 780 microns. And MIDS at a particle size of 590 microns. And then we had that our corn that was ground through a roller mill or a hammer mill at 737 and 324 microns. So before I get into the growth performance results today, I want to take just a moment to look at some of the physical characteristics of the diet. Here we have bulk density on the vertical axis, and we have our 6 diets across the horizontal axis. Now those diets that were fed in meal form are represented by the blue bars, and those diets that were fed in pelleted form are represented by the red bars. And then we have our 3 sets of diet across the bottom, whether that corn was ground through a roller mill, through a hammer mill, and lastly, if that complete mixed diet was ground through a hammer mill. So as we look at bulk density, the main thing that we need to take away from this slide is that we go as we go from feeding meal diets to pelleted diets, we see a significant increase in bulk density of these diets, suggesting that they're going to have some improved handling characteristics when we pellet those diets. And here, as we look at particle size of the diet, again, we only see the meal diets represented here. We see as we go from roller mill grinding that corn to hammer mill grinding that corn, we see a significant reduction in the diet particle size. And then we actually see a slight increase in diet particle size when we grind that complete diet. And this is probably noted by the fact that we did use a second hammer mill. So the hammer mill for this corn was different than the hammer mill that was used to grind the complete diet. And so we did see a slight increase in diet particle size. Now, it's important to note that there is an inverse relationship that exists between angle of repose, which we see here on this slide, and particle size, which we saw on the previous slide. So as we think particle size decreases here, we're actually going to see an increase in angle of repose. And just as a refresher, angle of repose is calculated by allowing feed to flow freely on a flat surface. We can then measure the angle of the pile that is remaining. The steeper the angle, the decreased flowability that we associate with that feed stuff. So a higher angle of repose represents decreased flowability, and we see that as we decrease the particle size, we actually see an increase in the angle of repose. And lastly, as we look at some of the diets that were pelleted, we see that we had PDIs all over 89%. So just wanted to point out that these pellets that we were feeding were of extremely high quality, and we can also see this when we look at percent fines, with percent fines from the diets all being under or at 1.3%. So extremely high quality pellets that were being fed. And again, these samples for percent fines were all taken at the feeder. So now as we transition into some of the growth performance, I'd like to note that the p-values or the statistics will be located in the upper left-hand corner. Today we'll be looking at 2 main contrasts, the first being a diet form by corn particle size interaction. And basically we're looking at these 4 diets here. To begin with, we're looking at the difference in corn particle size as we go to a decreased corn particle size, and then the interaction that exists between those diets being fed in meal or pelleted form. And lastly, we have our main effect of diet form, or the main effect of pelleting. We see that we compare all these meal diets versus all the pelleted diets. It's also important to note, and I'll only be mentioning it on this slide, but for all of my performance results, we had no significant effects of grinding the complete diet as compared to simply grinding the corn fraction. So here, as we look at average daily gain, we see that there was a trend for a diet formed by corn particle size interaction. So what exactly does that mean? Well, as we grind that corn finer from 737 to 324 microns, when those diets were fed in meal form, we saw a reduction in average daily gain. However, when we feed those same 2 diets in pelleted form, we actually see an increase in average daily gain. And lastly, we do have a main effect of pelleting here. We see as we go from feeding meal diets to the red bars or the pelleted diets, we see a significant increase in average daily gain. across all sets of diets here. Now, as we look at average daily feed intake, the same pattern exists for a diet formed by corn particle size interaction. This is a slight trend for an interaction. We see that again as we grind that corn finer, we see a decrease in average daily feed intake when those diets were fed in meal form. However, we actually see an increase in average daily feed intake when those same two diets are fed in pelleted form. As we look at the main effect of diet form, we see that there was no significant effect of diet form. We see that pigs fed meal or pelleted diets had similar feed intakes across all treatments. And lastly, as we look at feed efficiency, we no longer see that diet formed by corn particle size interaction. However, we do see a main effect of pelleting these diets, with pelleted diets having improved or increased gain to feed. And lastly, I want to look at caloric efficiency both on a metabolizable as well as a net energy basis. Here we have caloric efficiency on a metabolizable energy basis. Again, as I noted earlier, a smaller caloric efficiency is going to represent an improved caloric efficiency. It's more of a feed to gain number. We see, as we look at metabolizable energy caloric efficiency, we see no significant interaction between diet form and corn particle size. However, we do see a significant effect of pelleting these diets as we go from feeding meal to pelleted diets. We see a significant reduction or improvement in caloric efficiency. The same pattern appears here for caloric efficiency on a net energy basis. Again, there's no interaction between diet form or corn particle size. However, we do see a significant effect of pelleting these diets, which showed that pelleting diets improve caloric efficiency on a net energy basis. So in conclusion, the diet containing finely ground corn, which was fed in meal form, reduced both average daily gain as well as average daily feed intake. And to us, this suggests that there is a potential palatability issue in these young pigs when we feed a finely ground diet when fed in meal form. Fine grinding corn fed in pelleted form, though, actually numerically improved performance compared to finely ground corn fed in meal form. Pelleting diets improved average daily gain, feed efficiency, caloric efficiency, and final body weight as expected. However, there were no additional improvements that were found when the complete diet was finely ground compared to only grinding the corn. And with that said, I'd like to thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, you can email myself here, jadejong@ksu.edu, or you can call me at 616-780-9063. Again, I'd like to give a special thanks to the USDA for funding of this project. Thank you.